Please be aware that the following video contains massive spoilers for Across the Spider-Verse, including the very ending of the film. So, yeah, you've been warned. You can stick around if you want. Maybe having the whole movie spoiled for you is a canon event or something. I don't know. All right. Let's do this. Well, folks, I have seen Across the Spider-Verse. If you want my overall thoughts on it in more of a review format, there's the video where I did that. It's over in my secondary channel, the Break Room of Geeks. But I cannot stop myself from dipping into the discourse about it as trans allegory or possible flat-out depiction of trans characters. I say possible because it is somewhat debated amongst people. Now, no character in this is explicitly 100% stated as being trans. Most of the discourse surrounds Gwen Stacy, and I will go over that. But if I'm being completely honest, the is Gwen Stacy trans discussion, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit for me. I actually want to talk about the whole movie through a trans lens and give it a trans reading. Now, before we get too far along, let me clarify something right off the bat. Well, actually, two things. First, while I will be touching on Gwen and going over some of the things that lend themselves to reading her as explicitly trans, I'm not actually here to try and settle or make any argument, is she canonically trans or not? Because for my purposes, it doesn't really matter. Now, you can make an argument about whether or not it should be explicit representation, how good a thing that would be, and honestly, it probably would be a good thing, but that's not the conversation I want to have right now. Regardless of whether she is intended to be canonically trans or not, at the minimum, she does canonically support trans people because there is the Protect Trans Kids banner in her room. So that part is absolutely undeniable. Whether or not she herself is intended to be trans, again, we'll get into some of the bits of that, but for the most part, I will say that regardless of whether she herself is meant to be or not, her journey and certain aspects of what happened to her character throughout the movie absolutely lean into a trans reading of her character, and I do not believe for a second that any of that was accidental. So, we will be getting into that. But the other thing is that I need to remind folks that doing a trans reading of a piece of media is not the same thing as claiming characters in it were definitely meant to be trans. I've gone over this before. I did a video a couple years ago doing trans readings of actually 5 films, some of which did very much have indications that they were actually meant to be read at least partially through a trans lens, and others where it was just me giving that reading. Because giving that kind of reading to a piece of media means analyzing it through that lens, looking at it and thinking, how do the experiences and the events depicted here map onto a trans experience? What things that a trans person is likely to have experienced could be related to in this film? And on a similar basis, I did an entire queer and at points explicitly trans reading of Peter Capaldi's 12th Doctor. There's the link for that one. And no, that's not me saying that the 12th Doctor is canonically trans, but it is me saying that his journey, his character arc, spoke to me deeply as a trans person, and I explained why. So while I am going to be doing a trans reading of Across the Spider-Verse as a complete piece, this is not me saying that anyone other than Gwen is trans. And again, I'll touch on Gwen, and I'm not even really going to say definitively that she definitely is, but we are still going to touch on that. Nor am I saying that Miles or any other characters, like, they're definitely trans, I'm claiming them. No, I'm not. But I'm applying a trans lens to this because it fits on a hell of a lot more than just Gwen. But let's start there. Let's start with Gwen. So, first of all, there is a lot of the visual coding. There's the obvious thing that I mentioned of the Protect Trans Kids banner that she had in her room, but they've also added pink into her hair. Now, pink in and of itself is just one color, and most pride banners of any kind have minimum 3 colors involved in them. And that is also true of the trans flag, which, for point of reference, looks like this. Now, it is worth noting, first of all, that while it is not a universal truth that all queer people get a non-natural color put in their hair, it is a bit of a stereotype, and it is a bit of a stereotype for a reason. It is a thing that happens, but that certainly in and of itself is not a massive indicator. However, there is also a lot of lighting. There's a lot of very deliberate lighting and color choices across her scenes. It is not uncommon, especially when she is in conversation with her father, for her to be lit in a way that brings pink and blue highlights to the scene. And let me remind you that her outfit is predominantly white. So blue, pink, and white, those being the colors of the trans flag. And you have to realize that was a deliberate choice every time that happens. This is an animated film. There is no accidental quirk of lighting. There's no visual effect that could have happened by accident. Every single thing is a choice that was made because it all had to be created from scratch. So this lighting is not an accident. And that's kind of what I meant when I said that I do believe that it is pretty much impossible to argue that Gwen is not designed with the ability to read her as trans being built in, even if that is not intended to be the canonical read on the character. Because specifically, and before I get into this, let me be clear from here on out, spoilers for the movie, because I am going to be talking about the whole thing, but that's your warning. Don't watch this if you haven't seen the movie yet, or maybe you just don't care about spoilers. In that case, stick around. But when she has her big confrontation towards the end with her father, during the heart of her speech of what is in many ways a coming out speech, or at the very least a confrontation following a bad coming out, she is pacing back and forth in that kitchen, and she is lit pink, blue, super deliberately. It's waving through her hair. It's in the background. It is really, really deliberate. And it's, especially for a scene like that, it's really hard to not read it as a connection to a trans person trying to find some common ground, or trying to confront or even call out someone who matters to them in their life who initially rejected them. I mean, that is what she's doing. Regardless of whether you want to map it onto a trans experience, canonically, that is what she's doing. She's confronting her dad, who, when he first realized and found out that she was Spider-Woman, he rejected her. And now they're having a confrontation about it. And almost everything she says could be repurposed almost one-to-one as a conversation between a trans person and their initially unaccepting parent. It's really upfront. It's pretty blatant, and it's incredibly easy to read the trans allegory in that. And that includes the earlier parts of what happened between her and her father. Because, as I said initially, he does reject her. And it's not just that she is something that he's uncomfortable with. It's that she lied to him. And that can be the part that stings for some people. For some people who are like, I thought you trusted me, and you've been lying to me for how long about this? And even if that isn't something that happens, that's something that a lot of queer people fear. That even if the person that they know they should come out to has not expressly made disparaging remarks for what they are, that they're still going to be mad that it was kept from them. Or in the case of Gwen Stacy's dad, both are relevant because he's a captain who has been actively hunting Spider-Woman. So he's made clear his thoughts on her. And also, there's the pain of being lied to. And that's part of why the later scene where Gwen is lit up in very trans colors is so powerful. And it was one of, like, I basically choked up and teared up, if not flat out cried, at pretty much every single scene between Gwen and her dad. But this one especially, when she does the big confrontation with him, because he really does come across as analogous to a parent who, in the moment, from the shock, from the confusion, from the overwhelming, just trying to process everything that he's just learned, reacted badly and is trying to do better, isn't doubling down, but doesn't really know what to do to make it right either. It's really beautiful. So that's Gwen. And as I said, incredibly easy to do a trans reading on here. And indeed, more than a few are arguing that she is canonically intended to be trans. And then there's a whole side argument over whether, if that was the intention for her, should they have just flat out said it instead of super coding it? Because this isn't even coding. This is super coding. And that's a conversation that I think is worth having. It's just not the one I'm going to have today. But I said I wanted to expand the trans reading further out and apply it to more than just Gwen. Because I do. I want to apply it to Miles and indeed the entire movie. Because first of all, there is an inherent transness to the core conceit of Spider-Man. And it ties into what I've just said with Gwen, which is that when you have this relationship, this dynamic with people who matter to you, who love you, and you love them, but there's something that you've been keeping from them, something that's very fundamental about who you are, that you haven't told them, either because they have expressly stated a dislike for that thing that you are, or just out of fear of rejection or fear of anger that you've been keeping it, or all of the above. That is a very trans experience. And that applies to pretty much every version of Spider-Man. They pretty much all have that. So we already start with the fact that a core conceit of how Spider-Man always works is a very trans analogous experience. And it is interesting with Spider-Man in particular because he's one of the few whose secret identity really matters, because his ability, or often inability, to juggle his private life and his superheroing life is really at the core of the character in a way that it rarely is anymore. And even most of the older characters who had secret identities initially, it didn't matter to the degree that it does with Spider-Man. So you have this core central conceit that maps onto trans experiences quite well. And that applies, again, to all of them, pretty much. So the entire film. But there's some more stuff with Miles in particular. Because there's part of the experience that Miles has that I think maps onto a much more specific trans experience. And it's one that I wish that I have not experienced, or hadn't seen, or wasn't still seeing in certain aspects in certain places. But I have. And as a trans experience not often talked about, even from within the community. So here's the thing about Miles, compared to all the other Spider people. He's an anomaly. Which, first of all, was just brilliant. And I'm shocked I didn't see that specific aspect coming. That because the spider that bit him wasn't from his universe, he was never supposed to be Spider-Man. The Peter Parker from his universe was not supposed to die. And the spider that bit him was supposed to bite somebody else in a completely different universe. He's already disruptive by his very existence. And oftentimes, not meaning to be. Trans people, particularly those that don't fit the clean narrative and the binary of trans man and trans woman, clean transition of one gender identity to what is considered to be the opposite one, but instead falling on the non-binary spectrum somewhere, or even being on the binary spectrum but not conforming to the common story. It is not an uncommon experience to be made to feel like an anomaly by virtue of who you are, even within your community. Because that's the thing. This was another aspect of Gwen's story. When she had the rejection from her father, she fled. But she found community. She found people like her. And it's even said explicitly that Hubie let her crash with him. She was caught by a community of people like her when she was rejected by her family. And I will continue to point out things like the fact that trans people in particular, even amongst the queer population, are more likely to be ejected from their homes. It is often that community that will hopefully catch you if you have it and if you can find it. And Gwen does find it. And Miles thinks he found it, but he gets rejected because even within that community, he is seen as anomalous, as a hazard, as a danger to the rest of them. How does that map onto a trans experience? Unpleasantly. Speaking as someone who 10 years ago and more tried to grapple with the idea that I was a cisgender man who cross-dressed and was not actually some form of trans myself, I found a bit of rejection from the queer community. And I suppose, given the way I was identifying, although I never identified as straight, but I was straight passing, and I thought I was cisgender. And I want to be very clear, the community as a whole didn't reject me, but certain people did. Certain trans people did. They felt that me just being, and at the time I thought I was this too, a guy who puts on dresses, they felt that my existence somehow endangered or diminished their own. And that's something that would be reinforced and would come up again even after I came to terms with myself as gender fluid. Because if you're not familiar with the term transmedicalist, these are people within the trans community who are very committed to the binary and push forward the idea that the only valid way to be trans is to go through full medical transition, and that if you either haven't done or don't intend to do that, you're not really trans, or you're not valid as a trans person. And if you're somewhere on the non-binary spectrum, or if you're gender fluid like I am, you are super not valid as a trans person. And if you have very little or indeed no dysphoria driving you to embrace who you are, trans medicalists really reject that. Just as point of reference, if the idea of being trans without having dysphoria is confusing to you, because it's confusing to a lot of folks, I have actually done a video on that on one of my other channels. So if you want to pause this and go take a look at that so you understand what I mean when I say that, so I don't have to cover it all again here, you can do that. But again, it's that sense of rejection coming from within the community. And recently, we have seen in a number of forms members of the LGBTQIA plus community trying to reject or remove trans people from that equation. You have lesbians who identify as part of the gender critical or TERF movement, especially in the UK, where they have put a lot of effort into removing the T from LGBT. You can have people like certain cis gay men who will make an argument that the gay community should not support trans people, despite trans people having been part of gay and queer rights from the literal beginning of Pride. And regardless of the reasons for this, be it some sort of inherent or cultivated bigotry against trans people, or be it as a survival thing out of fear because they see all the things happening to trans people, all the attacks coming from certain aspects of society and social media and even the legislature in a lot of areas, especially in the United States, in places like Florida or Texas and many other states. And there may be fear from queer people who aren't trans seeing that and worrying that the attack on trans people will bleed over onto them by association, that they will all be dragged down. But regardless of the reason, whether it is a bigotry, whether it is a fear, like I just described, it doesn't matter. You still feel that rejection. And now to be very, very clear, this is not a case of the entire community that you thought would embrace you turning on you. That's not the literal reality. The aspects of the LGBTQIA plus community that do this are fringe elements. They get, unfortunately, disproportionate voices because they get boosted by people who don't like us, who aren't even part of the LGBTQIA plus community, but they are a minority. They are a tiny minority. Whereas in Across the Spider-Verse, in the movie, all the Spider people go against Miles, including the ones that he felt closest to, at least initially. The thing is, while in the movie, they pretty much all turn on him, or at least initially seem to. I'll come back to that. And whereas in reality, it's going to be a small sliver of people turning against you. It feels bigger. What happens in Across the Spider-Verse, the idea of every single person that you relate to and identify with, and you thought you had community with, turning on you, is how it feels when these things happen. So Across the Spider-Verse is true to the emotion of that happening, if not a clean mapping onto the reality of it. But then there's the other factor, which is, I mentioned, the whole community seems to turn on him, but also not really. Gwen has a lot of doubts. Peter B. Parker has a lot of doubts. And then by the end, we see her, him, and also a bunch of characters from the first movie commit to being with him and trying to fight alongside him for what is good for him, even if it's in opposition to the rest of the community. Because ultimately, while in the moment, maybe the whole community turned on him, that was ultimately driven by one person. And that was Miguel. Because the community trusts in him, and he has given his reasons, his rationale, but at the same time, he's very emotionally biased. His attempts to live the kind of life and do the kind of thing that Miles has expressed he wants to do ended horribly for him. So he has a very emotionally driven bias against what Miles is and what Miles will do. Another interesting thing to note about Miguel, but also his primary allies, at least initially, those being Peter B. Parker and Jessica Drew, is that they are older than Miles, than Gwen, presumably than Hubie, and their experiences of being Spider-Man, of being this community, is defined by pain, Quite literally, both Miguel and Peter B. Parker make an argument that the sacrifice and the losses that they suffered are defining to who they are, to the very nature of themselves.
What about Uncle Ben?
If not for Uncle Ben, most of us wouldn't be here.
Which is what trans medicalists say about dysphoria. They define being trans as being pain, and they see trans people who say, I don't experience that level of pain, or I don't think that should be what defines us, as invalid. And Miguel is trying to stop Miles, who is attempting to be Spider-Man, absent some of that pain. And while age is not the sole defining factor in this kind of divide, it is worth noting that much of the community that holds on to these beliefs tend to be a bit on the older side. And it is younger queer people who are increasingly pushing against that narrative and saying, we are part of this community, but we do not need to be defined by that. And so I said it wasn't true to the reality, because in reality, the entire community doesn't turn on you, but it feels like it. But in reality, the entire community didn't really turn on Miles. Like, they defaulted to what someone they trusted said because they didn't know what else to do. But as they come to better understand the situation, more and more of them aren't ready to do what Miguel says. Now, thankfully, by and large, the aspects within the queer community that are trying to push out trans people are not the leaders that everyone follows universally on instinct. We actually don't really have a ton of those within the queer community in the first place. Within smaller or more localized areas, maybe, but not collectively as a whole. Because you know what? This messy, quirky group that I have community with, we ain't a monolith. Not by a long shot. So there is that difference between reality and the film in terms of a trans reading, that Miguel is able to direct the entire community to action, whereas that's not really how it happens. But if certain people who are within the community who do turn against trans people, or a certain kind of trans people, because as I said, even within the trans community, you can get trans medicalists, or you can get people who just seem to not want anyone else to have a positive trans experience, even if they themselves did. It gets very weird sometimes. And that can come from directly within the trans community. And some of these people have followings. How many of the people who follow them are also part of the queer community is often debatable, but they still have followings. It can still feel, if you've ever been targeted by anyone like this, it can still feel like an army is descending on you. But oh, the feeling of realizing that there are people still on your side, which unfortunately Miles doesn't have yet. That's being saved for the next one. But that also brings me to the cliffhanger. Because yeah, I'm not done. I got one more bit of transness to read into this. The cliffhanger, the reveal of Miles from a universe where the spider originally came from. The Miles who should have been bitten and wasn't, and whose life has gone in a very different direction. A terrifying one. A life of not only crime, but of violence. And in many ways, Miles confronting this alternate version of himself, this version of himself that became the Prowler. It feels more than a little like getting a glimpse of who you would have become if you didn't become the person you were meant to be, and finding that horrifying. because I think if I ever got a glimpse of a version of myself who is the age I am now, who didn't come to terms with who they are, who didn't become who I know I am, I think that would horrify me. And I think Miles's reaction fits for that kind of reading, of seeing who you would have been if you weren't this key, core, fundamental thing that you know you are. But if you weren't that, would you like that person? If you're trans and you've ever asked yourself anything like that, the answer is no. No, almost definitely not. I'll be really curious to see where this goes in the next movie. Because the next film may or may not lend itself to as much of a trans reading as this one did. But my friends, if you so desire to read it as such, Across the Spider-Verse is really f***ing trans. Not just Gwen, but the whole movie. What are your thoughts on anything that I've laid out? Agree? Disagree? Again, keep in mind, this was a reading of the text. This is me applying a certain critical lens. This is not me saying that Miles is intended to be a trans character. So, don't give me that. All you'll do is expose the fact that you either didn't watch the video or did not actually listen to me and didn't pay attention. But whatever your thoughts may be, agree or disagree, drop them down in the comments and let's talk about it. Patreon is how I am able to do this as my living. Any support is of great help, but even if you can't do that, like, share, subscribe also help. There's links to other things that I do down in the description. But what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council, and I am just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Massive thanks to my Patreon supporters, and in particular, I want to thank Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfullah, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Ruth, Oliver B., Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Jen, Leotha Boyd, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernabilax the Poodle, Robin Powell, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Kasparov, Adam R.D.L. Taylor, David Hall, Shayla Gourlay, and Rosalind Bennett. Thanks for your support. You can get your name in the credits too if you feel like hearing me possibly struggle with it for several times before getting it right. It's kind of funny with my hair because initially when I colored it, this was a much more vibrant magenta, and you can see underneath a little bit more what that was originally, but that was more of a teal. But now that it's starting to fade, this is more of a pink, and that's more of a light blue. And so it's almost like I've got the trans flag in my hair. And if you find yourself going, oh, what? But isn't there white in there? I'm 41. Look closer. There's plenty of white mixed in there too. Yeah, I did a post-credit scene. What?